Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans. It's Neil Mack here with another edition of Myth and Magic, the podcast for fantasy fiction writers. And this week I'm going to discuss how to create your own unique senses and talk about chronoperception. And then later on, I'm going to talk about demon bowls and cover a little bit about ceramics because it's quite an interesting subject. But first, let's talk about how to create your own unique senses. My dad used to complain that my mother had no sense of time. And I understood what he meant because I was forever waiting for my dinner while my mum just finished a sewing project or a painting or some crafting. And my wife is the same. She has no sense of time. Craft-orientated people like my old mum and my wife, and probably me, truth be known, we get preoccupied by creative projects that we are working on. To the outsiders, it seems that we don't have any sense of time. But does this mean that creative people can't feel the passage of time? Or does it merely mean that they are absorbed and distracted by their imagination and the imaginative and creative processes, and they just want to get on with their projects? And anyway, and I'm sorry about this, Dad, but is chronoperception, and incidentally that means the sense of time passing, is chronoperception a real sense? Or is it just a pseudo-sense, like the sense of humour or the sense of fair play? If it is a true sense, then what organ does it use? How do we actually sense the passing of time? How do we actually physically do it? What's the science behind it? And then I ask myself, would an alien from an outside world, from another planet, require time perception at all? Especially if it existed outside our earthly time and space, which of course is regulated by the sun. And if an entity was a floating spirit or a deity and actually lived completely outside time and space, would it require any time perception at all? And if an organism counts eons instead of hours to develop and to grow, for example, there are endoliths that live at the bottom of the ocean for thousands of years without changing, and there are huge interconnected colonies of fungi which have lived for thousands of years. Do those type of entities need time perception or any sense of time at all? And what might those things have if they don't have a sense of time? What other senses do things like endoliths possess? And you may be saying, why are you asking all these questions? Well, if you're a fantasy fiction writer, these are exactly the type of questions that you're expected to ask. I would even go so far as saying you're paid to ask these type of questions, because these are the kind of questions that spark new stories and they facilitate fruitful imaginations. I spoke about fear on the last Myth and Magic podcast, which was episode 73, and it aired on the 17th of March, and how you should use the hormonal cascade to impart fear in your characters. And in that show I mentioned that our animal brains are capable of slowing down time when we face danger, which I think is amazing. It is magical. Although this phenomena, which incidentally is known as chronostasis, and chronostasis means the immobilization of time, is actually a disconnect between our normal visual sensations and perceptions rather than any special new ability that we've taken on. So it's not a new power, it's a disconnect of old powers. But chronostasis is interesting because it requires us as observers to focus on how we perceive our surroundings using our most important sensory organs, and of course they are the eyes, the ears, the skin, the nose and the mouth. But what if there are other receptors? What if we have other receptors inside our bodies which allow us to unconsciously perceive other mysterious things? Well, it so happens that we do. Yes, we humans, most of us, do possess other receptors, and through these lesser-known receptors, we do perceive other mysterious things. For example, I'll take an easy one for you. Most of us, if we're healthy, have a sense of balance. This is known as equilibrioception and is in other animals too. It prevents the animal from toppling over. The vestibular system, which is a labyrinth inside your ear and you can't see it, it does all the work for us. When the sense of balance is disrupted in an animal, it causes dizziness, disorientation and nausea, which is why we feel queasy in a rocking boat or woozy when we get off a spinning roundabout, and it's why astronauts must be trained to deal with the sick feeling that they get when they go weightless in space. But we also have a number of other interoceptions, and these are the sense receptors that are located within our body as opposed to kind of on the surface, because they're organ-based, and like the vestibular system, which is inside the inner ear, like I just told you, they can't be seen. So for most of us, when we're healthy, we can sense that we're full up after a big meal. Conversely, most of us can sense when we're hungry. And also most of us sense pain. We also have a thing called a vomeronasal organ, VNO for short, that weirdly is also present in snakes and lizards, and which we think, though nobody knows for certain, is used to sense chemical cues, pheromones, and this might explain some of our curious mating behaviours. Other animals have exotic senses, and these are quite exciting. For instance, some snakes can see the body heat of their prey, some bats can sense infrared light, and some birds can sense ultraviolet light. Some shrimp can perceive polarised light and multispectral images, and this means it's quite possible that they see colours that we humans wouldn't recognise. Magnetoreception, or magnetoreception, is the ability to use the Earth's magnetic field to navigate around, and some birds and herding animals do possess this sense, while echolocation, which is used by bats and whales, allows the animal to interpret reflected sounds in the same way that sonar works in submarines. Sharks and rays, and some whales as well, detect electric fields. This is called electroreception. They do this through their skin, and as far as we know, the platypus does this as well. And these creatures are likely to use the sense of electroreception to hunt in very dark waters. Hygroreception, on the other hand, is the ability to detect changes in the humidity of the atmosphere, and some insects use this sense before they construct their shelters. I think your responsibility as an ingenious fantasy fiction writer is to mingle, to merge, and just to think up new exotic senses for your human-like characters, or even better, in my opinion, to dream up some senses for your fabled creatures, so that your new creatures, your new, if you like, monsters, but they might be other fantasy creatures, are equipped with extraordinary and fantastical senses. But to steer you in the right direction, I want to suggest the following approaches. So when you're ready, I'm going to give you a 4-point plan for creating your own unique senses. So here we go. Think about why your fantasy creature needs such power in the first place. Is the new sense going to be used for hunting? Will it be used to escape or to camouflage itself? Will it be used to communicate with others of its kind? Or will the new sense be used for mating rituals? Does it require the exotic sense so that it can successfully achieve some other supernormal talent? And what I mean by that is, if you think about dragons, they must have some sense of altimetry. What I mean by that is they must be able to know how high they can fly. So if they have a sense of altimetry, they can judge how high they are flying. And maybe they'll need some kind of ion detection too. Because if they had an ion detection sense, then they'd wake up if they accidentally spat fire in their sleep. You imagine if you were a snoring dragon and you accidentally snored out some fire and burnt the whole cave down. Think of how the new sense might be contained within the physical body of the entity. Perhaps it's contained within a highly specialised organ, or perhaps it's part of the brain. And how will the animal or the entity maintain the good health of this sense? Will it require a specialised diet, for example? Will using the sense require practice? But us humans, we need to learn balance, don't we, before we can use a surfboard or we could ride a bicycle. We need to actually practice it. So perhaps these other animals might need to practice using their sense. Does the sense grow stronger or does it grow weaker over time? And we know, don't we, in humans, that sight fails as we age and our taste buds are never replaced. So perhaps all senses, whether they're exotic or not, they diminish over a lifetime. But what if some senses develop and grow as an entity ages? Perhaps because it needs the sense later in its lifetime, it might develop a strange new sense later. Think of synonyms next for existing and better known senses. So for example, what I mean by that is, instead of the word see, think of other words which mean see, and for example, distinguish. Hear, you might think of understand. Taste, you might think of as acquire. Smell, you might think of as inhale. And feel, you might think of as calibrate. You'll have to think of these yourself, but compile your own set of synonyms for better known senses, because you'll need them for component 4 of the exercise. Because component 4 is the fun part of the exercise. You'll have to add your synonym, in other words, the word you came up with for a better known sense, to something else that's weird and either magical or scientific-y. Don't forget all the other main points though, because your imagined creature or your imagined entity will require the new sense for a tangible purpose, and it must somehow be contained within the body. But to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, here's a list of my ideas. My first exotic sense, which I've just invented, is to do with seeing, and it's electrostatic distinction. And this is where an entity can see electrical charges. My next is to do with hearing, baryon comprehension. An entity hears interactions between atoms. My next one is to do with taste. So don't forget, I've used another synonym for taste. I've used acquisition. So this is ectoplasmic acquisition. This is where an entity can taste spiritual energy coming off of its prey. My next one deals with smell, crystallographic inhalation. This is where an entity smells crystal structures inside solids. And finally, this one deals with the sense of feeling. Hydrothermal gauging. This is where an entity can feel the onset of hydrothermal activity. Electrostatic distinction, baryon comprehension, ectoplasmic acquisition, crystallographic inhalation, and hydrothermal gauging. Hooray! Now it's time for you to think up your own exotic senses. Work out how they might be used in your creature or your entity or your human-like character. Consider the positives and the negatives of possessing such an exotic sense, and how your narrative might alter if your protagonist or your antagonist or the monster in your story possessed such an amazing sense. Let me know how it goes. Good luck with it. Good luck with creating your own exotic sense. If you've got your own exotic sense that you have just created and you want me to share it on Twitter, I will. Tweet me at Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word. Good luck with your exotic senses. What is a demon bowl? The manufacture of all ceramics is a miraculous process, even more so when you factor in the divine intervention that's experienced during the baking in the kiln. Each ceramic object begins life as a workable clay body, a weak, a feeble and a porous thing. And let's not forget that more or less all the world's mythologies and all the world's religions suggest that a deity created man from clay. And moreover, there's a sensible scientific hypothesis, and it's called abiogenesis, Abiogenesis, that suggests that all the building blocks of life are contained within a soft clay. So what I mean by the building blocks of life, the essential building blocks are the molecules, the RNA, the acids and the DNA. They're all found inside a soft clay. So it's not absurd to accept that man is made from clay. But back to the potter's art, there's certainly magic in it, which I'm going to explain in a minute. And from that magic we can find out what a demon bowl is. Here in the UK, Over the last weeks, we've been eagerly watching the Great Pottery Throwdown. I don't know if you have it in your country, but it's a television competition programme where contestants are tested on their pottery craftsmanship to win a series of heats and to become the Potter of the Year. Over the series, we've learned as an audience that pottery involves a lot of hard work and commitment and artistry. There's also something mysterious and mystical about ceramics, because once the handiwork is completed and the pot is fashioned, it's left in the kiln. And when it's left in the kiln, there's nothing a potter can do because it's hardening, it's drying, and it's chemically altering inside the huge temperatures that are found inside a kiln. A kiln is a type of very, very hot oven. All a potter can do while this bit of the process is going on is cross their fingers and hope for the best and maybe do a prayer. Sometimes the pot emerges from the kiln intact, but often it emerges from the kiln even more beautiful than the potter expected. But other times the kiln gods, this is what they keep calling them in the Great Pottery Throwdown, the kiln gods are not so kind, and the pot emerges from the kiln in pieces, or it's horribly distorted, as if it has been twisted in agony inside the hellish fires of the oven. These kilns, the ceramics ovens, have been around for at least 6,000 years. In fact, even the new Stone Age people were able to produce temperatures greater than 900 degrees in their kilns. Though ceramics have been around even longer than that, possibly, archaeologists guess, about 26,000 years. The earliest found ceramics were from South Central Europe. They were normally sculpted figures, not pots. But man has been making earthenware and pottery and ceramics since coming out of the cave, and probably before. Now, there's an element of prophecy in pottery, and we noticed this when we were watching the TV show. The potters would often say, "I pray this comes out the way I want it." And there's an element of tactility too. They will often say, "I have to be kind to the clay, I have to be careful with the clay, otherwise it will be unfriendly to me." And there's an element of artefact veneration, because the judges on the Great Pottery Throwdown show choose one pot each week, which goes straight into their museum for posterity. But finally, there's a tendency to see words and spirits working together in symbiosis. What I mean by this is that you'll often hear the contestants say, "I'm marking this pot with the words that my grandfather gave me. He always said to me, keep strength and give strength and you will always receive love." Words and spirit and memory working together in symbiosis to create something which has been around for 26,000 years and is part of us. So perhaps it's not surprising to find that ceramics are used in magic. And even though it's taken a while to tell you about it, that's what demon bowls are. Demon bowls were once buried face down. They were planted in the ground upside down, by the way, and that was intentional, in holy or sanctified places to capture demons. They were commonly planted under the thresholds or in courtyards, in the corners of the homes of recently deceased relatives, as well as in cemeteries. Demon bowls, they're also known as incantation bowls, are one of the earliest forms of protective magic there is in the world, and they work in the same way as amulets do. The idea is that they supposedly protect the living from the unseen dangers of demons. Demon bowls contained magical text, and this was a spiral inscription that was written by the potter onto the soft clay before firing. And those magical words were often rune-like to protect the charms inside the text. This incantation was thought to trap the demon in the ground under the bowl, which is why the bowl was upside down. The bowls that they found so far, and they found several hundreds of them, thousands, because they were very common, were usually the size of an average cereal bowl, or never much bigger than a salad bowl, and sometimes as small as an ashtray, but normally about the size of a cereal bowl. And most of the magical runes were written on the inside of the bowl, obviously to capture the demon, although sometimes words spilled over the lip of the bowl to leak outside it. And frequently, demons were depicted on the bowl as images. Often these depictions were of bound demons, most often a monster that had been represented with a shackled hand and a shackled foot. And this is a simple form of sympathetic magic. The demon is bound in the image, so therefore it's bound in real life too. Thus it's rendered harmless. That's what sympathetic magic is. Many demons in these bowls that were found across the ancient world were identifiable as female, though they were females, but not like any female you've ever seen before. They were normally bird-like alien females with claws instead of hands and feet, and they were feathered. In fact, many archaeologists have said that they look very similar to Lilith, who's the demon woman, and she was Adam's first wife, and she was expelled from Eden by God, or Ereshkigal, who's the goddess and the ruler of the underworld. So the demons often found on the demon bowls were feathered female-like aliens with claws, and they were virtually always shackled hand and foot. As a fantasy author, I think it's important for us to understand that demon bowls are more than just symbolic. They were, and they are, familiar and everyday objects that were obtained and used by common folk. You might even claim that these bowls were the first objects of primeval technology, because they're the first things we've ever found that were all across the ancient world, so they were very common. And technology, if you really want to purify it, the definition of technology is just the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes. Well, there was no science in those days, but there was magic. So if you change that to the application of magical knowledge for practical purposes, that's what a demon bowl is. A demon bowl is a form of knowledge that still embodies the inscrutable relationship between human handicraft, divine beings, Lilith or Eshkagal, and material objects like the pottery we've seen on the Great Pottery Throwdown show. So do you think you can use a demon bowl in your next project or something similar? And what about a story which follows an archaeologist or a treasure hunter that accidentally turns over a bowl that has contained a demon for hundreds, if not thousands of years? What would happen next? And what other ancient ceramic technologies can you think of that might be used to recharge or control or regulate or harness demons? Or, for that matter, if we are thinking about a demon bowl, what about an angel bowl? Something which releases angels. Food for thought there. So next week, I've got a special show. I'm speaking to the very talented Krista Wallace, who's the author of the Gatekeepers audiobooks. And interestingly, she's an audiobook narrator. She's an actor. She's worked in theatre for much of her life. So she's going to give us some tips about narrating your own audiobooks and narration. She's also written this fantastic trilogy, the Gatekeepers trilogy, and it's about sword fighting. So she's going to tell us a little bit about how to create choreography of sword fighting and how to describe a sword fighting scene. So that's going to be a really, really interesting interview. It's with Krista Wallace. My next show, it goes out on the 31st of March, so make sure you tune in for that. Meanwhile, have a productive week and keep writing.